She saw her toxic ex-husband, cutting through the chaos of the nightclub crowd. His eyes burning with that familiar fury that instantly awakened every painful memory she had buried. Without thinking, she threw herself toward the nearest man, a stranger with dark, brooding eyes and a tailored suit that spoke of danger, power, and a chilling calm. "Please," she whispered near his ear, her voice trembling with fear. "Don't let him find me." What she did not know was that she had just begged for protection from the very man people in Boston whispered about the most ruthless mafia boss the city had ever known, a man who had never shown mercy to his enemies. And in that moment, he decided she was someone worth keeping. Helen Carter, 48 years old, had once been a submissive wife for more than 20 years. Now she was a woman alone, trying to piece together what remained of her life. After divorcing and escaping the violent grip of Richard Evans, a man known for his cunning, control, and manipulation, Helen thought she was finally free, but men like Richard never let go easily. For 3 months she had changed her phone number, moved into a shabby rented room in South Boston, and even switched bus routes just to keep him from finding her. Yet fear clung to her like a shadow that refused to fade. Tonight, Karen, the only friend she had left, had dragged her to the Avalon nightclub with a simple plea: "You need to live a little." Helen, just one night without thinking. Helen didn't like noisy places and had no desire to drink. But faced with Karen's worried and slightly reproachful eyes, she forced herself to agree. They chose a corner near the exit, the only thing that gave Helen a sense of control amid the flashing lights and pounding electronic music. She took a deep breath and tried to sip the crimson cocktail Karen handed her. But the sharp taste of alcohol twisted her stomach. "Relax. You're safe here," Karen shouted over the music. Helen offered a faint smile, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat, as though afraid she might be swept away by the sea of strangers. And then her gaze froze on a face she would know anywhere. Richard. He stood across the dance floor, his head slightly bowed, green and red lights distorting his face into something monstrous. He was scanning the crowd like a predator scenting its prey. When his eyes locked onto hers, Helen's body went rigid. His mouth curved into that half-smile. She knew too well the one that came just before he erupted in rage. She shot to her feet, her heart pounding violently in her chest. Karen had vanished into the crowd, leaving Helen trembling, unsure where to run. The exit was blocked by dozens of dancing bodies. The restroom was a trap with no escape. She turned in panic, searching like a wounded bird desperate for shelter. And then she saw him, sitting alone in the secluded VIP section, a man with tousled dark hair and features so sharply defined they looked carved from marble. He wore a jet-black suit and held a glass of whiskey that glimmered under the light. He wasn't watching anyone. He seemed untouched by the chaos around him, like a god presiding over disorder. Without thinking, without being able to think, Helen crossed the velvet barrier, ignoring the guard's startled look, and ran straight into his arms as if he were the last lifeline left to her in a drowning sea. She clung to his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder, her voice shaking with each word. "Please, don't let him see me." She didn't see how Vincent Moreau's eyes changed the moment her arms wrapped around him, nor how his lips curved slightly, whether in surprise or intrigue. She couldn't tell, but she felt the strength of his arm encircling her waist, steady and sure. No questions, no resistance, only a quiet murmur, low and deep like aged whiskey. "Breathe. Sweetheart, you're safe now." Helen had never felt protected by anyone before, not by Richard, not by anyone. And though she knew nothing about this man, one thing was certain: if anyone could make Richard stop, it might just be the stranger she was holding on to, like a lifeline in a storm. What she didn't know was that she had just stepped into the eye of a far greater storm. Vincent's body tensed briefly under her sudden touch. But in a single heartbeat he made his choice. His arm tightened around her waist, his other hand resting lightly on her back, as if she had belonged to his world all along. The scent of her hair soft, simple, unadorned by the expensive perfumes he was used to slipped into his senses, like something unfamiliar yet hauntingly human. She trembled in his embrace, her whispered plea tearing through the calm in his mind. He lowered his head, voice deep and measured, more like a vow than comfort. "You're safe." Helen didn't dare look back, but she felt the shift in the air through Vincent's stillness. Heavy footsteps approached Richard's. Then came the voice of a security guard, firm and unyielding, blocking his path. "She ran in here. I have the right to talk to my wife." Helen stiffened. But Vincent's hold didn't waver. "He's my ex-husband," she whispered. "I have a restraining order. He's not allowed near me." Vincent said nothing, but his eyes turned sharp as blades. With a simple glance toward his bodyguard, a large man with an expression carved in stone, he gave a barely perceptible nod. Instantly, the guard stepped forward, securing the entrance. Richard shouted threats, but they died under the weight of a single cold stare. "Does he bother you often?" Vincent asked, eyes still fixed on Richard being dragged away. Helen nodded faintly. "I've done everything I can. New place, new number, hiding, but he keeps finding me. The law, it doesn't help." Her voice cracked, half anger, half despair. Vincent tilted his head slightly, studying her with an unreadable look. Then he spoke again, that same low voice, but now with quiet authority. His name Richard Evans. She blinked at him. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have involved you. I just panicked." Vincent shook his head, his gaze cool and glacial. "You did the right thing. If a man like him dares to threaten you in public, it means he thinks you have no one behind you. Now you do." The words stunned her. She didn't know who he was, only that he carried an aura that made the entire room seem to fall silent with the slightest movement of his brow. As Richard was escorted away, Vincent finally released her, signaling for a waiter to bring water. Helen rose unsteadily, hands still trembling, but Vincent caught her instinctively. He didn't ask why she was so afraid. He didn't need to. What mattered to him was eliminating the threat. She was about to thank him when he spoke first. "I'm Vincent. That's all you need to remember." Helen blinked. "I'm Helen." He nodded once, turning his gaze back to the amber swirl in his glass, rotating it slowly as though weighing a decision. In that moment, Helen couldn't look away from him. The calm posture, the eyes that seemed to see through everything, the quiet voice that carried weight without effort. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. Part of her wanted to leave, to retreat from the dangerous pull she sensed in him. But another part, the weary, broken part of her that was so tired of being afraid, just wanted to stay. Here, in the presence of a man who made everything else, even Richard, seem small. "Has he ever hurt you?" Vincent asked, his tone almost casual, yet the air around them seemed to freeze beneath the weight of his gaze. Helen nodded, her throat tightening. "I was hospitalized once. 3 broken ribs. But he hired a lawyer. He knew how to deny everything." Vincent studied her for a long moment, then murmured, as if speaking to himself, "Men like that always believe they're untouchable. They thrive on power, and on the silence of those they break." Then his phone rang. He picked it up, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "I want everything on Richard Evans. His past, his work, where he lives, who he knows. Don't make me repeat myself." He ended the call and turned back to Helen. "From this moment on, I want him gone from your life." Helen stared at him, her emotions colliding inside her, part terror, part relief so deep it ached. For years, she had fought alone, doubting her own worth, surviving on fragments of hope. And now, with a single desperate embrace, she had stepped into the orbit of a man whose mere glance could make the world step back. She didn't know who Vincent really was, but she knew one thing with terrifying certainty: when a man like him decided to protect someone, nothing could stop him. That was when she realized not every dangerous man is meant to be avoided. Some are meant to stand behind you. The scent of burnt coffee and fried oil clung to the air of the Red Oak Diner like a stubborn fog that refused to lift. Though Helen had grown so used to it, she hardly noticed anymore. The morning felt no different from any other. The sky was dull gray, the wind seeping cold through the cracks in the diner's old walls along the South Boston Highway. Behind the counter, She tightened the frayed cream-colored apron around her waist and poured more coffee into the thermos. Her mind still echoing with Vincent's voice from the night before. From this moment on, I want him gone from your life. Just a few words. Yet they rang in her head like an oath. She couldn't stop replaying them. For months, she had lived almost invisible, waking each morning in fear that Richard would appear without warning, flinching every time an unknown number called, double-locking her apartment door in Dorchester, pulling the curtains tight, keeping a kitchen knife in the nightstand drawer. She had lived that way too long. But last night, for the first time in years, she had drawn a full breath without feeling someone's eyes watching her from the dark. Rosa, the morning manager, called out from the kitchen, snapping Helen from her thoughts. Helen. You. Okay. You look like a ghost from last night. Rosa, 61, was a small woman with a voice like a church bell. She'd seen enough people in her lifetime to know when something was wrong. Helen forced a small smile and refilled the cup of a truck driver at the counter. Just didn't sleep much, she said. The truth was she hadn't slept at all. After leaving the Avalon nightclub, Vincent had her driven home. He hadn't asked for her address. He simply nodded to the driver, as if he already knew every place she had ever been. Before the car stopped, his voice came through the tinted glass, quiet. Steady. If anything happens, call me. Then a business card slid through the small gap in the window, thick. Expensive. Printed with nothing but a single phone number. No name. No address. No logo. Helen had held it all night, keeping it under her pillow like a strange kind of protection. The diner door chimed, its familiar bell cutting through the hiss of the fryer. Karen walked in, dark circles under her eyes, hair tied up in a rushed knot. Good grief. You look like me. After 2 nights binge-watching The Godfather. Helen gave a faint smile, but her gaze drifted to the window. Last night, Richard came to Avalon. Karen froze mid-sentence. That man, how did he know you were there? Helen shook her head. I don't know, but I found a way to keep him away. She didn't want to say more. She wasn't sure whom she could trust anymore, not even Karen. Her oldest friend. Karen pulled out a chair, resting her chin on her hand. Look me in the eye. Helen, and tell me who that man was, the one you held onto like your life depended on him. Helen hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. She still didn't know what to call Vincent. A savior, a danger, something in between. She finally whispered, eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. A stranger, but the only one who made Richard stop. Table 5 needs more ketchup. Rosa's voice cut through the moment. Helen nodded and stood, as if the conversation had never happened. Yet in her mind, Vincent lingered, his dark eyes, the calm power in his voice, the invisible promise he had made that felt like a sentence already written. She didn't know what consequences their encounter would bring, but she knew her world was no longer the same. And perhaps, neither was she. The bell above the diner door jingled again, just as Helen was setting a tray of ketchup on table 5. She didn't bother to look up, assuming it was another regular. But then a chill, sharp and sudden, crawled down her spine. Every instinct in her body screamed in warning. When she turned, her heart dropped to her stomach. Richard Evans stood in the doorway, hands in his coat pockets, eyes locked on her as if the entire room had vanished, and only she remained. His hair was slightly disheveled, his light gray suit a little rumpled, but his shoes gleamed as always. That look, carefully composed, just messy enough to seem human, had always been part of his disguise. People once mistook him for a polished, intellectual gentleman. Now most avoided him, especially after the scandal of their divorce and the accusations buried by his lawyers. Helen didn't know how he had found her job here, nor how he dared show up in public after everything, as if there were no restraining order, as if he hadn't once choked her unconscious in their bedroom a year ago. Her grip tightened on the ketchup tray, fighting the tremor in her knees. His footsteps echoed across the old tiled floor, each click of his polished heels unnervingly calm in the quiet morning. Hello, darling, he said. the familiar half-smile, returning the same counterfeit gentleness she once mistook for love. "We need to talk." Helen stepped back. "You're not allowed here." "I'll call the police." Richard raised an eyebrow. Amused. "The police. You know they won't do anything. And if they come, I'll just tell them I stopped in for breakfast. No one can arrest a man for ordering eggs." From behind the counter, Rosa had already sensed what was happening. She set the coffee pot down with a thud and stepped forward, her small frame radiating authority. "What's going on?" "Helen, it's fine," Helen said quickly, forcing her voice steady. "This customer was just leaving." "Really?" Richard smiled and turned to Rosa. "I just came to see how my ex-wife is doing. A friendly visit. That's all." "She's fine," Rosa said sharply, eyes narrowing. "And you need to go. Now." Richard sighed, his hands still buried in his pockets. But his gaze turned to ice when he looked back at Helen. "I thought you'd have learned some manners after all we've been through." "I'm not your woman anymore," Helen said through clenched teeth. "And I'm not afraid of you." Richard gave a faint chuckle, leaning in so close that only she could hear. "No. Then why did you run into another man's arms last night? In front of everyone. That was quite a scene. Do you even know who he is?" "Helen, or were you just desperate enough to hide behind a fancy suit?" The blood drained from her face. "He knew. He had been watching. Don't fool yourself into feeling safe." Richard continued, his voice still soft but edged like steel. "Your Vincent can't protect you forever. Men like him, do you really think he'll stick around when things get complicated? Believe me, Helen, men like that only keep what's valuable to them. And you, get out." Rosa's voice rang out, louder than the radio humming in the background. Two regulars by the door stood up. One of them, a tall former Marine, towered over the room. Richard knew he had no advantage left. He merely shrugged, straightened his collar, and cast Helen one last look, his eyes burning with something that made her stomach twist. "We'll see each other again," he said, his tone stripped of mockery now. "And next time, no one will stand between us." He turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him like the sound of a verdict waiting to be carried out. Helen stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears, her grip on the tray so tight that her knuckles turned white. Rosa placed a steady hand on her shoulder, gentle, but firm. "Call the police. Helen, and more than that, call the man you held on to last night. If he's who I think he is, now's the time to ask for his help." Helen swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she pulled the card from the pocket of her apron. The thick, cold rectangle of paper felt almost metallic against her palm. She stared at the single number embossed into its surface, then exhaled slowly. The nightmare had returned. But this time, she wasn't alone. A sleek black Lincoln Navigator rolled to a silent stop in front of the Red Oak Diner less than 20 minutes after Helen made the call. She didn't know why Vincent had answered after just one ring, or how he knew exactly where to find her. His voice had been calm, low, and certain through the phone he'd asked only one question. "Are you hurt?" When she said no, his reply was simple. "Go outside. The car's waiting." No explanation. No hesitation. Helen had only enough time to tell Rosa, "I need to take the afternoon off," before stepping outside, where the car door was already open, and a driver in a leather jacket stood waiting. Expression unreadable. The drive unfolded in silence. Through the thick glass, Helen watched the familiar, worn street slide away, replaced by clean cobblestone roads, lined with maple trees glowing under the pale autumn light. When the car turned into Beacon Hill, her heart thudded hard against her ribs. She had heard of this place, one of Boston's oldest, wealthiest, and most secretive neighborhoods, but she had never imagined she'd come here. Least of all as someone being escorted like a protected witness in a crime film. Vincent's mansion sat behind black wrought-iron gates adorned with intricate scrollwork. The surrounding wall was veiled in ivy, concealing whatever world lay within. When the car stopped, the driver stepped out first, opened her door, and motioned her forward with a nod. The main doors, carved from dark walnut, opened soundlessly to reveal an interior so vast, it took her breath away. She entered a grand hall floored in polished marble, the ceiling soaring high above her like the nave of an old theater. Curving staircases swept up on both sides, and a chandelier of crystal and brass glittered like a constellation suspended upside down. Oil paintings lined the walls, their tones muted and centuries deep, mostly portraits. The air carried a faint blend of warm wood, aged leather, and something else, entirely, something indefinable, intimate, uniquely Vincent. It made her feel both lost and strangely drawn in. Vincent appeared at the top of the staircase, not in the immaculate suit she remembered, but in a charcoal sweater and dark trousers, hands in his pockets, his composure as effortless as ever. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, as though she could hear time itself moving beneath his feet. When he reached her, his gaze remained calm, almost terrifyingly so, but his voice was unexpectedly gentle. "I told you to call if anything happened." Helen nodded, forcing her voice to steady. "He came to the diner, threatened me in broad daylight, as if no law could touch him." Vincent didn't ask for details. He simply turned to the driver. "Where's Marco, 3rd floor?" "Meeting with security." Vincent nodded once, then looked back at her. "Go to the sitting room. You need to rest. Maria will bring you something to eat. We'll talk tonight." Her instinct was to protest, to say she couldn't stay, that this wasn't her place, but the words dissolved under his gaze. It wasn't exactly commanding, nor was it tender. It was the look of a man accustomed to obedience, and certain he would receive it. Maria, a warm-faced Italian woman whose hands always smelled faintly of toasted bread, guided Helen down a velvet-carpeted corridor to a room overlooking the garden. The late afternoon light spilled across a bed draped in white linen, the space quiet as a chapel. Helen sat on the edge of the mattress, slipping off her shoes, her body still taut with lingering fear. The room around her felt timeless, carefully arranged, not ostentatious, but every object carried the weight of decades. It was a world far removed from the greasy diner and the cramped apartment with moldy walls and echoing footsteps. Through the window, she saw a stone path winding toward a manicured garden, where a man patrolled with a radio in hand. Every movement outside was silent, precise, mechanical, like a system designed to never fail. And then it struck her. The world Vincent inhabited was not one people simply stepped into and then left again. Once she crossed that threshold, nothing could ever return to the way it was. Not with Richard, not with herself. Helen awoke to the dim amber light of dusk filtering through the curtains. She couldn't remember when she had fallen asleep, only that her body felt lighter, as if for the first time in months she had rested without fear. Beside the bed sat a tray on a walnut table, warm chicken soup, a crisp loaf of bread, a glass of apple juice, and a small, handwritten note in firm, deliberate script. "Eat. We'll talk at 7. V." Helen traced the ink lines with her fingertips, as though searching for meaning in the way he wrote. No exclamation marks, no urgency, no excess words, just quiet certainty. When the clock in the room struck 7, a gentle knock sounded at the door. Maria entered, her eyes carrying a quiet reminder. "Mr. Vincent is waiting for you in the study." Helen followed her down a gleaming wooden hallway where the warm chandelier light shimmered across the polished floor like rippling water. Vincent's study was unlike the rest of the mansion, warmer, darker, filled with the scent of old books and fine tobacco. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with volumes in Italian and French. A detailed map of Boston hung on the wall, not a tourist map, but the kind used by law enforcement or people who lived outside the law. Vincent stood before a tall window, a glass of red wine in hand, the firelight behind him carving cold shadows across his face. "Did you sleep?" he asked without turning around. Helen nodded instinctively, then realized he couldn't see and whispered, "Yes, thank you." Vincent set the glass down and turned toward her. "That man Richard. He's not just an angry ex-husband. I had someone look into him. He used to work for a law firm with indirect ties to the Rossetti family." Helen's chest tightened. The name felt distant yet familiar. The Rosettis, an Italian crime family operating out of New Jersey. Not large, but reckless. If he ever worked for them, even as a middleman. His fixation on you isn't personal anymore. It's a signal. She felt as if invisible hands were closing around her lungs. You mean, I'm being used, or targeted? Vincent poured more wine, but didn't drink. He sat and gestured for her to join him. I need to know everything. About your history with him. The things you haven't told me. Helen hesitated, then sat down, her fingers nervously twisting together. I met him when I was 27. He was 30. Charming. Polished. Said all the right things. At first, it was like living in a dream. Roses. Rings. Weekend getaways. But then he started to control things. First what I wore, then who I saw, then where I worked. Every time I resisted, he said it was because he loved me. The first time I tried to leave, he cried, begged, promised he'd change. And a week after I believed him, he hit me for the first time. Her voice didn't tremble. Something in this room made her feel safe enough to speak, not ashamed. Not hiding. After the hospital, after the broken ribs, I finally left. But he didn't stop. Letters. Calls. People watching me. The restraining order meant nothing. Vincent listened in silence. His eyes held the same glacial calm. But beneath it flickered something she couldn't name. When she finished, he spoke quietly. There are men who exist only to prove they can control everything, especially the women who dared to walk away from them. She looked at him, truly looked for the first time. And you? Why do you exist? Vincent didn't answer right away. He moved to the fireplace, lifted the poker, and stirred the embers. I exist to keep safe what I consider mine. He turned back to her, eyes no longer distant. And from now on, Helen, if he lays a hand on you again, I won't let him live long enough to speak about it. Helen's hands tightened over her knees. In a world where the law had failed her, his words rang like a sacred vow, not from a hero, but from a predator who had chosen to guard rather than devour. And against all reason, something inside her exhaled in relief. By the time she left the study, night had fully descended over Beacon Hill. The hallway outside was wrapped in a peculiar stillness. Her footsteps soft against the polished floor. Vincent's words echoed in her mind like a whisper that refused to fade. From now on, if he touches you again, I won't let him live to tell about it. It wasn't comfort. It was a promise from a man who did not speak idly. She had seen it in his eyes. That blade beneath the still water. And somehow, that very danger made her feel safe. Paradoxical, terrifying, real. She returned to the guest room Maria had prepared. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. One missed call from Karen. She hesitated, then pressed redial. Karen answered almost immediately. Helen, thank God. I've been calling all day. Her voice was rough, anxious. Are you okay, after what happened with Richard? I was terrified. Where are you? Are you safe? Helen paused. She didn't want to lie. Yet she couldn't tell the full truth either. I'm staying with a friend. Just for now. Richard can't find me here. That friend, Karen said slowly. Is it the man from the nightclub? Helen said nothing for one heartbeat. Then two. Finally, she whispered. Yes, it's him. Karen sighed audibly through the line. Helen. Listen, I asked around about him. And what I heard, none of it's good. Helen frowned. What do you mean, Vincent Moreau? The name isn't new to people in Boston's underworld. My cousin works at the federal courthouse. He's heard that name in a few investigations that got quietly dropped. Nothing proven. But the pattern's always the same. People who do business with him either disappear or they stay silent forever. Helen's fingers tightened around the phone. You're saying he's a criminal. I'm saying you need to know what you're walking into. He's not like Richard. Helen. He's smarter, colder, and if he's taken an interest in you, you'd better be ready. Helen sat motionless in the dark, staring out the large window. Outside, the garden glowed softly under amber lights. Men dressed in black moved in measured circles. Silent, Methodical. Precise. Everything was still, controlled, perfectly ordered. "Karen," she said at last, her voice barely above a breath. "I know where I am, and I know who he is." "No, you don't," Karen replied quietly. "I saw the way he looked at you that night, as if you were something to own, not protect. Helen, you've already survived one kind of prison. Don't step into another just because its bars are made of gold." Helen closed her eyes. The phone pressed to her ear. "I don't need anyone to tell me what it feels like to be controlled. I know that feeling. Vincent doesn't make me afraid. When I'm with him, I don't feel small." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Karen's weary sigh. "I just don't want you to mistake power for safety. I've seen that look before. Helen, the same one you once saw in Richard. The kind that makes you feel protected, until you realize you've been swallowed whole." Helen said nothing more. The call ended in silence. Without a goodbye, she sat motionless in the elegant room, the soft light glinting off the polished wood floor as the night breeze stirred the curtains. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe Vincent was dangerous. Maybe this was all part of a larger game she didn't yet understand. But maybe, just maybe, for the first time in her life, she was standing on the side of power. The thought was frightening, yet it carried a strange sense of release she had never known before. The next morning, Helen awoke with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the softness of the bed or the way the sunlight slipped gently through the curtains. It was the absence of fear. For the first time in years, she hadn't woken to the pounding of her own heart. Sitting up slowly, she could still hear echoes of Karen's voice from the night before, her warnings looping in her mind like the remnants of a dream. Helen knew Karen was partly right, but she also knew she was no longer the naive woman she once was. Vincent might be many things, but she was no one's prey anymore. She left her room and wandered down the long corridor toward the main floor. The mansion was hushed, filled only with the faint sounds of cleaning and distant footsteps. Near the dining room, she caught fragments of a low, clipped conversation, voices steady and authoritative. She paused, not out of curiosity, but because something in the tone made her uneasy. "Who is she?" a man's rough voice demanded, each word bitten off. "Not Vincent. We know nothing about her past. She shows up out of nowhere. And Vincent brings her home without explanation. We all need to keep an eye on that." Another voice responded, quieter but firm. "If she were a threat, don't you think Vincent would know?" Helen froze. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but her feet wouldn't move. The first man spoke again, sharper now. "I don't believe any woman can make Vincent cancel a meeting with Chicago and assign night guards just because he met her in a nightclub." Silence. Then the second voice. "Caution is fine, but if Vincent's decided, it's not our place to question it." A door opened. Helen startled and stepped back toward the staircase, pretending to be on her way down, just as a tall man appeared. Their eyes met instantly. No greeting, no smile. "You're Helen." His voice was deep, measured. Helen nodded. "Marco, I handle Vincent's security." He looked like he'd been carved from discipline itself. Military posture, close-cropped hair, eyes sharp as razors, though he stood a few feet away. She felt as if he could see right through her. "If you need anything, talk to Maria. If you want to leave the house, someone goes with you." Helen kept her composure. "I was just walking around. I didn't mean to eavesdrop." Marco didn't respond, only gave a curt nod and turned away. But before he disappeared down the side corridor, he paused. "Vincent doesn't usually let people into his world. That makes it our job to be cautious. You should understand it's for your safety." Helen stood there, watching him go. She didn't blame him. In his place, she would have been suspicious too. What unsettled her was his gaze, not just probing, but warning. Maybe she really had stepped into a place no one left freely. Maybe, as Karen had said, this was a gilded cage. But maybe, she thought, she had just touched a world where survival required becoming part of it. And Helen, though she hadn't said it aloud, I knew she was already changing. She was no longer thinking merely about surviving. For the first time, She was thinking about existing on her own terms, in a world built on ghosts and secrets. Marco's suspicion didn't frighten her. It fueled her resolve. Later that afternoon, Helen stepped out of a black SUV parked near Copley Square to take a short walk. As Maria had suggested, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No name, no greeting, just 2 short lines. Meet me in Boston Common. 3rd bench to the left near the Swan Pond. Come alone. Her heart clenched. She knew who it was. There was only one man who could still find his way into the smallest corners of her life, no matter how many locks she changed or walls she built. Richard. Helen deleted the message the moment she read it, but her hand trembled as she slid the phone back into her pocket. She could call Vincent. She could return to the car and let his men handle it, but something inside her refused. She had been running too long. Maybe this time. She needed to face him. Boston Common in autumn glowed with fading gold, under the soft slant of late afternoon sunlight. The park looked almost too peaceful for what was about to unfold. Helen followed the stone path at a steady pace until she saw him. Richard sat casually on a wooden bench, a paper coffee cup in hand, head slightly bowed as if in thought. When he noticed her shadow fall across the path, he looked up and smiled, a smile so familiar that it dragged every dark memory back to the surface. You came, he said, as if this were just a chance meeting between 2 old lovers. Helen stopped several steps away, keeping her distance. What do you want to talk? You know there's still unfinished business between us. There's nothing left to say. I'm not yours anymore. Richard shook his head slowly, as if she were a child who'd missed the point. Helen, do you really think your precious Vincent can protect you forever? Do you honestly believe he cares about you? He's not a savior. He's a predator, and you're just his newest distraction. Helen felt her stomach tighten, but kept her face still. Richard leaned back, eyes tracing the clouds. You know what's funny? He's like me. Very much like me. Only worse. More dangereux. You never understood me. Helen, you thought you could escape. Start over. And now look at you running into the arms of a man darker than the shadow you left behind. Vincent doesn't hit me, Helen said quietly, her voice cold and precise. He doesn't make me flinch at the sound of footsteps in the kitchen. He doesn't turn love into a weapon. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. He doesn't have to. Helen, he can make you feel small with a single glance. He doesn't need his hands. His power lives in the fear of others. You think you're stronger with him. No, you're just another pawn in the game of a man who manipulates everything. Helen took a step closer. I'm not anyone's pawn. Not anymore. Richard tilted his head, his eyes glinting with something new, something that looked disturbingly like surprise. Or perhaps the faint realization that the woman standing before him was no longer the one he used to break. Then why did you still come here alone? If you're as strong as you think, why is your heart pounding like that? Helen could feel her chest tighten. But she didn't back away, because I wanted to see what worse thing you could possibly say. To know for sure I was right to leave you. And I was right. Richard rose to his feet and stepped closer. But Helen didn't move. He stopped, staring into her eyes not with the gaze of a man threatening power, but of someone who sensed control slipping from his grasp. You don't understand. Helen, we've been bound together too long. Things like that don't just disappear. Vincent can't keep you forever. Sooner or later, he'll walk away, or he'll push you out when you're no longer new. And when that happens, you'll have no one. Helen turned without answering. Be careful with what you call freedom, he called after her. Sometimes it's just a bigger cage. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, Helen walked away from Richard without fear, only certainty. She no longer needed anyone to pull her from the darkness, because now, she was learning to walk through it herself. When she returned to the mansion, Helen felt both drained and strangely clear. She hadn't told anyone she was leaving, hadn't asked for an escort. Vincent had said she should never go out alone. But this time she needed to face things on her own. And she had. Richard's words still echoed faintly in her mind, like trails of smoke. But they no longer had weight. He was stabbing at old wounds, but the woman he once controlled had died that night. She ran barefoot through the rain, bleeding and broken. The woman who had stood in Boston Common today was someone else entirely. As she crossed the grand foyer, Helen noticed Marco by the window, his sharp eyes cutting toward her. He said nothing, only gave a curt nod. Maybe he knew where she'd gone. Maybe he'd been watching from a distance, but he didn't ask, and somehow that silence made her feel safer. Back in her room, she slipped off her coat and sat near the window. Pulling out her phone, a new message from Karen stopped her cold. "Are you okay? Anything new?" Helen almost typed the usual reassurance, but instinct made her pause. Something wasn't right. She replayed last night's conversation, the urgency in Karen's voice, the way she'd pushed about Vincent, about who he really was. It had sounded reasonable at the time, like concern from a friend. But after seeing Richard, Helen began to see the pattern. He had known exactly where to find her, what time she'd be alone. The tone of his message echoing the same manipulation he once used to control her. He knew she'd been in the park, but how she scrolled back through old texts with Karen, reopening messages she'd thought she'd deleted. She read carefully every line, every phrase, and then she saw it. A small detail, impossible to ignore. Karen had once written, "Are you really leaving Boston for good, or just hiding in some house in Beacon Hill with that Mafia boss you call your savior?" Helen's pulse quickened. She had never told Karen that Vincent lived in Beacon Hill. Her hands trembled as she opened her call log. An unfamiliar number had called her once, then hung up. She had assumed it was Richard. But what if it wasn't? What if it was someone else? A middleman, a watcher, or worse, a friend? Helen stood abruptly and walked straight to Vincent's study. The door was already open. He stood behind his desk, reading a thick file. When he saw her, there was no surprise in his face. "We need to talk," Helen said, her voice steady but resolute. "About Karen." Vincent placed the file down. "I was just about to call you for that very reason." He pushed a thick envelope across the desk toward her. Inside were printed emails, text transcripts, and audio files. All of them, from Karen to Richard, and to someone named Matteo, identified as a Boston contact for the Rossetti family. Karen owed a lot of money, Vincent said quietly. Gambling debts. She borrowed from people she shouldn't have. Richard arranged to clear it, but in return, she had to give him information. "Not at first, but once you disappeared and reappeared with me, he needed eyes on you." Karen became that connection. Helen's throat went dry. She flipped through the pages, messages about her movements, addresses, times, even the name of the guard who stood outside her door each night. She was the link, Vincent said evenly. "And you've been caught in the middle of a setup." Helen collapsed into a chair. Breath knocked from her chest. Karen, who had wiped her tears the first night she ran from Richard, who had brought her soup when she was sick, who had held her hand in the hospital and whispered, "I'll never let him touch you again." Now Helen understood. Some ghosts didn't come from the past. Some wore the faces of friends. And sometimes, the cruelest betrayal came from the hand you trusted most. Rain began to fall suddenly as Helen left the mansion later that morning. She needed airspace to think, to escape the suffocating weight of the truth. Vincent had urged her to stay. Marco had offered to send someone with her. She refused. She only needed a few hours. She promised not to go far, just around Beacon Hill, where every street was lined with cameras, where Vincent's men watched every corner, but caught between anger and heartbreak. She didn't notice the shadow that had followed her since she stepped past the gate. Her black umbrella blurred the world into shades of gray. Yet the unease beneath her ribs grew sharper with each step. She crossed an intersection, intending to stop by the small bookshop on Charles Street. Just as she reached for the door, a white van screeched to a halt at the curb. Two figures in black raincoats jumped out with mechanical precision. One clamped a chloroform-soaked cloth over her mouth. The other wrapped his arms around her like steel bands. Helen struggled, twisting violently, but her strength vanished in seconds. The last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her was the relentless drumming of rain against the metal roof. When she awoke, the air was thick with damp and rot. Her throat burned, her head throbbed, Her wrists were bound behind her with plastic ties. Her ankles fastened to the legs of the chair. Through her blurred vision, she could make out the grim outline of an abandoned warehouse concrete walls. Piles of crates. The heavy stench of oil and sawdust. A single flickering fluorescent light hung from the ceiling, humming faintly, as though even it didn't want to witness what would come next. The metal door at the far end creaked open. A tall figure stepped inside. Dressed in a black suit without a tie, he removed his mask, and Helen recognized him instantly. Matteo Rossetti, the man who had taken over what was left of the Rossetti syndicate after the purge 4 years ago. Not a household name, but whispered about as ruthless and cunning as his late father. "Miss Helen," he said, his voice both polite and chilling. "At last. The mate in person. I've heard so much about you." Helen stared at him without answering. Her throat burned from thirst, but she forced herself to stay calm. Matteo sat down across from her, crossing one leg over the other. "Vincent Moreau has been hiding you, like buried treasure. I'll give him credit, he's clever, but not as clever as I am." He tilted his head slightly, studying her as though inspecting an artifact. "Do you know why you're here? Not by chance. Not because you're a victim. You're here because you're the key." Helen pressed her lips together, refusing to show fear, though her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. "Vincent has destroyed 3 of our supply routes in 6 months." Matteo went on, his tone darkening. "He emptied an entire warehouse in Fall River, burned 2 shipping containers at the Chelsea docks. He wants to corner us." He drew closer, his voice vibrating with restrained rage. "But he made a mistake. He let emotion get in the way. He let you into his world." Matteo rose from his chair, circling behind her. The sound of his shoes struck the concrete in deliberate rhythm. "Now I have you, and Vincent will have to choose bow down, or watch you carved into pieces." Helen snapped her head around, eyes blazing. "You won't break him, and you don't know me." Matteo chuckled, leaning close enough that his breath brushed her ear. "I don't need to know you. I just need to know what he'll do when you start disappearing. 1 finger, 1 photo, 1 recording. You think Vincent is strong. Everyone has a limit. Helen, and I'm very good at finding them." Helen gritted her teeth, the heat rising in her face, but she didn't make a sound. Matteo straightened and strode to the door. "Keeping you alive is part of the game, but don't flatter yourself. You're just a pawn, and pawns are made to be sacrificed." The door slammed behind him, leaving Helen alone in the flickering half-light, surrounded by the smell of dust and decay and the brutal truth that this war was no longer about her and Richard. It had grown far beyond that. Now she was at the center of a silent war between 2 dark empires. She didn't know if she would live to see daylight again, but one thing she knew for certain: if even the smallest chance to escape presented itself, she would not wait to be rescued. She would fight with whatever strength remained in her. Helen didn't know how long she drifted in and out of consciousness inside that freezing room. Her wrists burned from the plastic ties cutting deep into her skin, her legs numb, her head throbbing with a low hum that never stopped. There was no clock, no window, only the flicker of the dying fluorescent light above, and the thick darkness pressing in from every corner. The only thing keeping her awake was anger, simmering deep and hot beneath the fear she refused to feel again. Then the door opened. This time, it wasn't Matteo. The silhouette that entered was disturbingly familiar, the tall, confident walk she knew too well. Richard. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his movements casual, almost leisurely, as if he were visiting an old acquaintance, instead of standing before the woman he had helped kidnap. "Hello, darling," he said softly, too softly for the circumstances, his voice a parody of tenderness, like an actor stepping back into a tired old play. Helen didn't answer. She met his gaze head-on, her eyes steady, not the eyes of a victim anymore, but of someone standing unflinching in the center of the storm. Richard smiled faintly, pulled up a metal chair with a screech, and sat facing her. "I think it's time we had a little talk. Privately. No Vincent. No guards. Just you and me. Like old times." Helen clenched her fists. the plastic biting into her skin until she felt blood. But she didn't blink. If you're here to play the wounded lover, you're too late. You tore that mask off long ago. Richard tilted his head, his eyes flashing like a serpent ready to strike. No. Helen, I didn't come to beg. I came to remind you that you never really escaped me. You think you ran? That hiding behind a man more dangerous than I am makes you free. No, you're still part of this game. He stood and began pacing around her, each step echoing on the cold floor. Calculated and heavy. Do you know why Vincent cares about you? It's not because you're special. It's because you're my weakness. Your leverage. He's not saving you. He's using you to wound me. But when he's done, when he's had enough, who'll be left for you then? No one. Not a soul. Helen turned her head toward him, her gaze sharp as glass. I'd rather be alone than ever crawl back to you. Richard froze for a moment, then laughed a dry, hollow sound stripped of humor. You've changed. Helen, once you cried over me. Now you talk like you're the one pulling the strings. He leaned closer, his breath thick with smoke. But remember this. No one walks out of my world without leaving something behind. The price you'll pay is only beginning. Helen didn't look away. You're wrong. Richard, I already paid. I've lost everything, fear, trust, freedom. There's nothing left for you to take. And a woman with nothing left to lose doesn't break as easily as you think. Richard stopped laughing. He studied her for several seconds, as if searching for the fragments of the woman he once owned, and realizing, with something like dread, that she no longer existed. His eyes darkened. You really think Vincent's coming for you? He sneered. He's too busy protecting his empire. You're the weakest link in his chain. Helen. And when that chain breaks, you'll find out just how alone you truly are. Hele met is gaze. Her voice low but steady. Then you'd better hope you're gone before he finds me. The door slammed shut behind Richard, leaving her once again in darkness. But this time, she wasn't afraid. His venomous words no longer pierced the armor she had built around herself. She didn't know whether Vincent would reach her in time, but she knew one thing for certain. Richard had just made the greatest mistake of his life. He hadn't imprisoned a broken woman. He had locked up a flame, and fire, when cornered in the dark, will burn through anything to survive. The old warehouse lay smothered in shadow deep in Boston's southern industrial district, where the sewers owned the corridors and the streetlights no longer bothered to flicker. But tonight, it wasn't rats that would claim the concrete floors, it would be blood. Outside the main gate, a black SUV crept forward like a phantom. Lights off, engine growling low, then falling quiet again like the breath of a predator about to strike. Vincent sat in the back seat, eyes glinting like blades in the dark, a loaded Glock resting steady in his hand. Beside him, Marco adjusted his headset and murmured into the comms. His voice a calm rumble. Target confirmed. West signal disabled. 5 guards, 2 inside. 3 patrolling. No noisy. Helen must not be harmed. Move. Vincent didn't reply. He opened the door and stepped out. Every movement measured, forged in silence and violence. He didn't shout, didn't curse, but everyone in his team could feel it, the quiet storm that, once unleashed, would leave nothing alive in its wake. Inside, Helen remained bound, head pounding, but her eyes sparked when she caught the faint sound echoing down the corridor. Not Matteo's deliberate steps, not Richard's heavy ones, something else. A chill quiet that smelled like danger. Then came the first gunshot. Not 1 but 2. 3. 4. Screams followed, the crash of bodies hitting concrete. Boots pounding in panic. The steel door burst open. Hinges torn apart. A dark figure stormed in, dropping 2 guards before they could draw breath. Helen held her breath. And then she saw him, Vincent. He didn't look like a savior in shining armor. He looked like retribution incarnate. His coat was splattered with blood, his eyes glacial and focused. The men of Rossetti's crew didn't even have time to aim before they fell one by one, each gunshot echoing like a heartbeat against the walls. Richard appeared from a side corridor, a trembling gun clutched in his hand. He yanked Helen up, pressing the barrel to her temple. "Stop, stop, or I'll shoot." Vincent lifted both hands, stepping forward slowly, his gaze fixed on Helen. "Let her go." "Richard, it's over. You think you're untouchable. She dies before you take another step." Helen shut her eyes for the briefest second, then drove her elbow back with all her strength, slamming it into his gut. Richard doubled over, the gun clattering from his grip. Vincent didn't hesitate. One shot clean and precise. The bullet tore into Richard's shoulder, sending him sprawling across the floor in a spray of blood. Marco and 2 men rushed in, securing the scene within seconds. Helen collapsed into Vincent's arms, trembling but conscious, eyes wide and lucid. He pulled her close, his voice hoarse against her ear. "You're safe now. No one will ever touch you again." She gripped him tightly, saying nothing. The nightmare was over. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and adrenaline, the punctuation mark at the end of a long, brutal chapter. But in that chaos, within the embrace of the man the city feared most, Helen felt peace, not because the world had suddenly become safe, but because she knew that from this moment on, no one would ever make her kneel again. Vincent hadn't come merely to rescue her. He had come to prove that she was no one's pawn. She was the reason he'd entered this war. And this time, he'd won. The rain poured on, relentless, washing over streets stained with blood and ruin. Inside the warehouse, silence lingered, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living. Helen was led to the car first, per Marco's order. His face remained impassive as ever, though his hands, when he steadied her, were unexpectedly gentle. Vincent stayed behind, his gaze fixed on Richard's body, sprawled in a widening pool of red. The bullet wound in Richard's shoulder had drained him fast. His face had gone gray. His breath came in broken gasps, but hatred still flickered in his eyes. He lifted his head weakly, watching Vincent approach one slow, deliberate step at a time, like death crossing a threshold. "You think I'll beg?" he spat, blood bubbling between his teeth. "You think you're better than me because you've got money. Power, I had it all once. She was mine." Vincent stopped 3 paces away. His eyes were colder than the rain, deeper than the night itself. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The verdict was already written there. In silence, "You're wrong," he said, his voice low, metallic. "She was never yours. You caged her, controlled her, hurt her, but she never belonged to you. Helen isn't a possession, and you're not a man." Richard let out a ragged laugh that broke into coughing. "And what are you then, her savior? Don't kid yourself. You're just another monster in a better suit. You and me, we're the same. Bastards with better aim. The only difference is who we choose to destroy." Vincent stepped closer, looking down at him as though weighing the final judgment. He drew the Glock from his belt unhurried, unceremonious. Outside, the headlights from Marco's patrol cut through the rain, spilling a crimson streak across Richard's face. Vincent said nothing more. He raised the gun, aimed between Richard's eyes. In that suspended heartbeat, Richard understood this was the first and last time he'd ever faced someone beyond the reach of manipulation. Beyond fear. The gunshot was clean. No scream. No plea. The bullet pierced through his forehead, and his body crumpled to the floor, blood spreading beneath him like a curtain closing on a roll long overdue to end. Vincent stood still for a moment, then turned and walked away without looking back. He didn't need to. Justice in his world didn't come from a courtroom. It came from choice. And tonight, he had chosen for Helen to end the nightmare. Outside, Helen sat in the SUV, eyes heavy but awake, staring toward the warehouse doors. When she saw Vincent emerge, soaked, blood-stained, yet calm, she didn't ask. She simply reached for his hand as he got in beside her, feeling the warmth of blood on his wrist. Unflinching. "It's over," she asked softly. Vincent nodded. He won't be coming back. The SUV rolled into the darkness, silent and sure, leaving behind the past sealed by gunfire. Richard was gone, and Helen, at last, was free. But freedom came at a cost. In a world where justice was written in bullets and blood, liberation didn't come from forgiveness. It came from a single, perfectly timed shot, delivered by the only man who understood that some monsters could not be redeemed. The Beacon Hill mansion glowed in a pale amber haze as the black SUV slipped through the iron gates, its tires whispering over rain-soaked cobblestones. Inside, Helen leaned her head against the window, watching the familiar branches glide past the same ones that had sheltered her days ago. Now that it was all over, now that Richard could no longer haunt her, she didn't feel the relief she'd imagined. There was no celebration, no triumph, only silence deep and endless like the sky after a storm that had taken everything with it. Vincent said little on the drive back. He sat beside her, his large hand tightening around hers every so often, a wordless reminder that she was still here, still alive, and had made it through. Yet Helen's mind refused to stay still. It ran in two directions at once, one toward the old world of Richard, the darkness, the fear, the years of invisible captivity, and the other toward where she sat now, beside a man whose power, secrets, and unspoken shadows were vast and unknowable. When the car stopped at the white stone steps, Maria was already waiting with a dry towel and a large umbrella. The chill bit through Helen's skin. But she walked slowly, needing no one's help. Inside the mansion, warm light filled every corner. The faint scent of mint tea drifting from the kitchen, so peaceful, so ordinary, as if the blood and gunfire of the night had never happened. She settled into a chair near the fireplace, letting the heat seep through her trembling body. Vincent approached, poured tea into a porcelain cup, and placed it gently into her hands as though she were something fragile, something that might shatter with a single careless touch. "You can stay here as long as you want," he said, his voice low, and even as always, but softer. "Somehow, no one will ever touch you again. Not anyone." Helen looked up at him. "Do you ever regret letting me into your world?" Vincent was silent for several seconds, then shook his head. "No. You're the only thing in it that doesn't make me feel filthy." The words caught in her throat. Inside, her emotions spiraled: gratitude, fear, tenderness, doubt. She knew she no longer belonged to the ordinary world. Yet she wasn't sure she belonged here either. She stood between two lines on one side, a fragile freedom as thin as glass. On the other, a power denser as smoke. Vincent had saved her life, but he was also a man who could destroy everything if his heart ever turned cold. That night, Helen lay awake in the soft luxury of the guest bed. She rose at last and stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving beads of water clinging to the wrought iron railing. Below, the garden slept beneath its grid of security lights, high fences, quiet guards, nothing like any place she had ever lived. Yet she knew safety didn't come from walls or guards. It came from choice. She was standing between two worlds now, where each decision could open a new chapter or pull her back into the same abyss. She was no longer who she once was, but not yet someone new. She existed in the in-between, learning to live with, her eyes open and her heart on guard. Behind her, the glass door opened softly. Vincent draped a light robe over her shoulders and stood beside her without a word. They didn't need words, only presence, only warmth. A brief stillness amid the storms that hadn't yet fully passed. And in that quiet, Helen understood whatever path lay ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but at least now, she wasn't running anymore. She was facing it, and that was the first step toward real freedom. The next morning, Boston's sky hung gray, as though the city itself was recovering from the long night of blood, gunfire, and emotion. Helen didn't leave the mansion. She didn't open the windows. She sat by the small writing desk near the balcony, turning the pages of an old notebook Maria had found in the suitcase from her first day there. Part of her wanted to reconnect with who she'd been. Part of her was simply trying not to think. But forgetting was impossible when the phone began to vibrate with a call from a number she knew too well. Karen. Her chest tightened. She had deleted that number, once sworn she'd never hear that voice again. Yet today, "Jeg finger betrayal her," she answered. Karen's voice came through, hoarse and slow. I didn't think you'd pick up. But, if you're listening, please don't hang up. Helen's hand tightened around the phone. But she said nothing. Richard's dead. Isn't he? Karen went on, her tone wavering between panic and relief. I heard the news this morning. A small time boss shot in a warehouse down south. Everyone knows it was Moreau's people. And I know you were there. Helen swallowed hard, staring out at the garden beyond the glass. I'm not calling to apologize. Karen continued. I know, sorry. Doesn't mean anything now. I just want you to know something I never had the courage to tell you. Helen closed her eyes. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear, but she didn't hang up. I started working for Richard last year. After I got pushed out of that investment deal, I was drowning in debt. He came in like a savior. He didn't say what he wanted, just that one day I'd help him get closer to you. I was stupid enough to think it meant helping you go back to a world you belonged to. You'd changed so much after leaving him. Quieter. Distant. Like I didn't know you anymore. Helen let out a faint, tired laugh, not from sadness, but from exhaustion with excuses she'd heard too many times before. But then things got out of hand. Karen said, when he found out you were living with Vincent Moreau, he lost control. He wanted details, every move, every person, every corner of that mansion. And I gave them to him. I thought he just wanted to see you. I didn't know he'd kidnap you. I didn't know he meant to kill you. I didn't know. Stop, Helen said at last, her voice cutting through. Karen, what I'll never understand is how you could look me in the eye every time I told you I was afraid of him, that I couldn't breathe when he showed up in my dreams and still feed him information. Silence. Then a long, weary sigh, because I was weak too. Helen, the difference is, I didn't have anyone to pull me out like you had, Vincent. Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. No one pulled me out. I dragged myself out. And you were the one who pushed me back down. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Karen spoke again, her voice small. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope one day you won't think of me with hate. It isn't hate, Helen said softly. It's nothing. She ended the call. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. Real light touched the balcony. Helen set the phone down and took a deep breath. No anger, no bitterness, just the calm after a storm. In a world where trust could be bought and friendship could turn to betrayal, Helen had learned to stand on her own feet. That final call wasn't closure, it was a burial. A quiet farewell to the part of her past she no longer wished to carry. The phone rang again just as she set her teacup down on the wooden table beside the window. Morning light filtered through the autumn leaves, painting her face in a pale, reflective glow. The number wasn't saved, but she knew it immediately. She didn't need to check twice. It was Karen, the friend who had once shared her brightest years and later sold her to the man she feared most. Helen let the phone ring 4 times before pressing accept. She didn't lift it to her ear. She held it close to her chest instead, as if she needed one more steady breath before she could face the voice on the other end. Karen's voice trembled through the receiver, thin and breathless, as if drained of strength. I know you don't want to hear anything from me, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need you to listen. Once, then you can do whatever you want. Helen closed her eyes and leaned her head against the window frame. She said nothing, but Karen understood that silence was permission. I never meant to betray you. Not at first. Karen went on, her words shaking. I didn't plan to sell you out to Richard, but I owed money. Helen, more than I could ever admit. After losing my job at the investment firm, everything collapsed. No one helped me. No one stayed. And then Richard came. He said I only had to keep an eye on a few things, that you'd be safe. He promised to clear my debt. I was stupid enough to believe he only wanted to see you again. Helen bit her lip, her hand gripping the armrest until her knuckles turned white. The puzzle pieces began to click into place, every harmless question, every feigned concern, every time Karen had somehow known where she was or who she'd met. None of it was care. It was reconnaissance. The trail that led Richard straight back to her. When you moved in with Vincent, Karen continued. I wanted to stop, but Richard started threatening me. He had photos of my mother. He knew where she lived. He said he'd hurt her if I didn't keep going. I was scared. Helen, really scared. But I didn't stop. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. I let my fear become an excuse to hand you back to the man who almost destroyed your life. Helen opened her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. You didn't stop because you chose not to. Don't use fear as an excuse. I've been more terrified than you could imagine. I just didn't betray anyone while I was afraid. Karen fell silent. Only her shaky breathing came through the line. Maybe she was crying. Maybe she had finally realized that every excuse had lost its weight. You knew who Richard was. Helen went on. Her tone wasn't raised, but every word was clean and sharp as a blade. You knew what he did to me, and you still gave him information. Not once. Over and over. Every message. Every address. Every routine. You didn't just betray my trust. Karen, you dragged me back into the pit I nearly lost my soul escaping from. A quiet sob slipped from the other end. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Karen whispered. I don't dare, but I called so you'd know it's over now. Richard's dead. His network is collapsing. And I'm leaving Boston. Not to run away, but because I don't want to be the wound that keeps reminding you of the past. I just hope that someday you won't think of me with hate. Helen smiled faintly. No anger. No venom. Just the weary curve of someone who had crossed the border of pain and had no desire to look back. I don't hate you, she said softly, but there's nothing left to hold on to. You're the past. Karen. And I don't live there anymore. She hung up before Karen could say another word. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the last few golden leaves that clung to the trees in the garden. Helen set her phone down, stood, and stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, sharp, alive. She drew in a deep breath, feeling her chest grow lighter. The past no longer weighed on her shoulders. It had spoken its last through the voice of an old friend, and now she could close that chapter for good. The late afternoon light slid across the red brick roof of the Beacon Hill estate, tinting the weathered walls with a gentle gold glow. In the backyard garden, Helen stood with a cold cup of tea in her hand. The autumn breeze lifted her hair, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. That morning's call with Karen had marked the end of something, not with forgiveness, not with anger, but with quiet completion. Yet inside her chest, a hollow space remained where fear used to live, now filled with the uncertainty of how to begin again. Helen had always believed that once Richard was gone, she would finally breathe freely. But freedom, she realized, wasn't just the absence of a man. It was learning not to see herself as a victim anymore. It was learning how to step into a life chosen, not one imposed. Behind her, Vincent's steady footsteps sounded place. But she didn't turn. She heard him stop a few paces away, close enough to be near, far enough to give her space. Marco says you haven't eaten all day, Vincent said, his deep voice soft as the wool coat he laid over her shoulders. I'm starting to think I'll have to lock the kitchen to get your attention. Helen let out a small, unforced laugh, the first in a long time. I just feel strange, like I've fallen into a life that doesn't belong to me. Vincent stepped closer, following her gaze over the garden, sinking into twilight. Because you've never had the chance to choose before, he said. Everything that happened to you, someone else decided. You just reacted. Helen stayed quiet. Vincent turned to look at her, and for once his dark eyes weren't cold or commanding. They held the quiet of a man who had seen too much and finally learned when silence was enough. But now it's different. Helen, he said slowly, each word deliberate, solid. You're not prey anymore. You're part of this place, part of me, your family. Helen turned to him, startled. The word family echoed inside her like something both foreign and achingly familiar. She'd once had a family, a home, a sense of safety before Richard turned them all into shackles. She'd thought she would never feel that again. I'm not sure I remember how to be part of anything, she whispered. I've lived so long on guard. Running. Surviving. I don't know what to do when someone stays. Without control. Without demands. Without cages. Vincent reached for her hand. His touch, gentle, unhurried. You don't have to do anything, he said. Just be yourself. Family doesn't need perfection, only honesty. Helen met his eyes, and for the first time, the quiet inside her didn't come from numbness, but from peace. She placed her hand over his light, but steady. I'm still learning how to trust, she said softly. Even myself. Then let me stay. Vincent replied, his voice low, almost a vow, until the day you no longer have to learn. They stood there in silence beneath the late autumn sunset, needing no grand words or sweeping promises. The greatest truth was simple. Helen no longer felt alone. She was no longer prey in a hunt without end. She was a survivor. She was the one who remained, the one chosen not by circumstance, but by someone who had once believed in nothing beyond power and control, and who now placed her, quietly but irrevocably, at the center of his heart, under a single word: family. Later that night, Helen sat alone in the grand study of the Beacon Hill mansion. The chandelier's glow reflected softly across the polished oak desk, scattering pale golden patches of light like the last traces of a dying sun. In front of her lay a thick envelope. No note. No address. Only the red wax seal of the Moreau family. Vincent had left it there that morning, offering no explanation. No pressure. But Helen understood. Inside was an invitation, or more precisely, a choice. Within the envelope lay everything: dossiers on Vincent's business partners, names that existed nowhere in any official record, maps of shipping routes she'd only ever heard whispered about in underground investigations, and a list of those who had once betrayed him. Each line was precise, cold, merciless. She knew what it meant. If she kept it, if she moved forward, she would no longer be merely the woman Vincent protected. She would be part of his world, not at the edge anymore, but at its very core, a cog within the machinery, one of them, and there would be no turning back. When Vincent entered the room, he didn't rush. His steps were measured, his expression calm, eyes still as water beneath the night sky. I don't want you to see it as a chain, he said quietly. Helen turned to face him, her hand resting on the envelope. No, she replied. I see it as a door. The question is whether I'm ready to walk through it. Vincent nodded, but something flickered in his gaze: worry, and perhaps pain. If you walk away, I'll still protect you. Just as before. You don't have to enter this world to stay. Helen smiled faintly, no longer hesitant as she had been once. I know, but if I stay outside, there will always be a part of you I can't reach. I've lived too long in the shadows of others. I don't want my light dimmed by the man I love, even unintentionally. Vincent moved closer, lowering himself into the chair opposite hers, his hands resting near hers on the desk. You understand, this isn't like joining a company. This is a life without exits. Once you're in, you can't be a bystander. Helen nodded, her gaze steady. I don't want to watch anymore. I want to understand. I want to know why the man I love chose this path. Why he can be so cold to the world, yet so gentle with me. I want to be the one who isn't afraid of you, who doesn't doubt you, and who isn't blinded by you either. Silence enveloped the room for several long seconds. Then Vincent reached forward, drew the envelope closer, and placed it into her hands. Then you'll start by reading this. No one can choose for you. But once you do, you'll see everything differently. There won't be room for innocence, or for gray areas. Helen took it, feeling its weight as though it held her fate inside. Yet her eyes shone not with ambition, but with clarity. She was no longer the Helen who had once hidden in a stranger's arms to escape. Now she was stepping forward by her own will, on her own feet. When Vincent stood to leave, he paused at the door. I used to think keeping you outside was the best way to protect you, he said softly. But now I know if you're part of me, then the only safe place for you is within the circle itself. Helen said nothing. She only nodded, opened the envelope, and began to read. Outside, the wind howled against the windows like a final warning. But she wasn't afraid, not because she had grown fearless, but because she had chosen, and sometimes, choice alone is what turns prey into the one who commands the game. Morning draped Boston in a heavy veil of fog. The cobblestone streets glistened with rain, and the garden trees of the Beacon Hill mansion looked freshly washed, as though the night itself had rinsed away their dust. In the upstairs study, Helen sat at her desk, holding the black fountain pen Vincent had given her a week earlier. Beside it lay the stack of files now covered in notes along every margin. She couldn't recall when she'd begun waking before dawn. No longer startled by sounds. No longer haunted by Richard's shadow or Karen's voice. What filled her now was something deliberate, a stillness that felt earned. As if her mind had crossed into a different country. The past was still there, but it no longer led the way. She had read every page, every number. Every line from the Swiss bank transfers to the travelogues of men she had once thought were ordinary businessmen. None of it shocked her, perhaps because she'd been preparing for this truth all along. The reality of Vincent's world didn't lie in words like mafia or underworld. It lay in how power moved silently, elegantly, and sometimes necessarily. When Vincent appeared in the doorway, he didn't interrupt her thoughts. He simply waited. Helen lifted her gaze. Her eyes were calmer than ever. "I've finished reading," she said. Vincent nodded and stepped closer. "And what have you decided?" Helen closed the file. "Set the pen aside. I can't go back to being an outsider. Not after knowing. Not after feeling it." Vincent pulled a chair opposite her, his expression one of understanding rather than judgment. "Then you're ready to be part of it." Helen met his eyes. Unwavering. "I don't know how good I'll be, but I know that if I keep standing on the sidelines, I'll always be the one waiting. Afraid. Dependent. And I've lived that way for too long." Vincent didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened, as though a burden he had never admitted to carrying had just been lifted. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small silver key, placing it on the wooden desk between them. "This is your office. In the building behind the main house. No one goes in except you and Marco. I'm not expecting you to work like a recruit. I just want you to have a space somewhere to observe, to take note, and, if you ever feel the need, to speak." Helen picked up the key. The cold touch of the metal no longer made her hesitate. It was no longer a symbol of power, but of agency, something she once thought she'd never reclaim, after all those years of control and fear. They walked down the marble corridor together, their footsteps echoing in quiet rhythm. Below the staircase, Maria had already set the breakfast table, while Marco stood by the counter checking his phone, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He looked up when he saw Helen. This time, there was no trace of suspicion in his eyes, only the steady gaze of a man who understood that this woman was now one of them, even if no one said it aloud. Outside, the black car waited with its engine running. The driver in his dark suit held the rear door open. Helen looked at Vincent not with absolute confidence, but without fear. "Let's go," she said. Vincent smiled, truly smiled for the first time. "There's no turning back." "You know that." Helen nodded. "I don't need to." As the car rolled out of Beacon Hill, tires humming over the cobblestones, Helen looked out the window and caught her reflection then and now. She saw the woman she'd been months ago, frightened, flaying, so fragile that a single glance from the past could break her apart. That woman no longer existed. She was not being chased anymore. She was the one choosing where to go. And even if the road ahead was lined with blood, shadow, and compromise, at least it was hers. No one forced her. No one pushed her. This was a beginning born not of innocence, but of will. A quiet afternoon settled over Boston, sunlight slanting softly across the roof of the Beacon Hill mansion. The golden light spilled through the garden, where Helen sat with Vincent beneath a canopy of white-blossomed vines. The distant hum of the city faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Vincent poured more tea into Helen's porcelain cup, his movements slow and unhurried, as though time itself had finally ceased chasing them. In that pale light, Neither of them needed to speak. Silence was no longer heavy, it was peace. The peace that exists only between two people who have both walked through storms and found, at last, the same shore. Helen lifted her gaze toward the sky, where the clouds drifted aimlessly without destination. She had been like that once, drifting through her own life, existing only to survive. But now, she was living, not perfectly, not safely, but truthfully, and by choice. Her heart, once constricted by old wounds, now beat in rhythm with the present, with freedom, with trust. Vincent placed his hand on the table. Helen's hand brushed against his. "None of us are clean," he said quietly, his voice steady as a truth that needed no defense. "But sometimes, in a world without justice, the only things that can save us are loyalty and love that's real." Helen nodded. She had stepped into this world, not out of obligation, but because she understood that here, at least, she was no longer alone. And even if she had to face difficult choices and moral shadows, she would stand beside the man who had seen worth in her when she couldn't see it herself. Life doesn't always offer an easy road. Sometimes, good people must make ruthless decisions to protect what matters most. And sometimes, the woman once seen as weak is the bravest of all for daring to face the darkness in order to find her own light. This story is one of rebirth of a woman who went from being prey to becoming her own master, of a love born in the chaos of escape, but nurtured through choice, trust, and sacrifice. If this story touched something within you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you see a little of Helen in someone you know, or perhaps in yourself? Have you ever felt lost within your own world? Leave a message, a question, or simply a feeling. We would love to hear from you. From the heart. And if you were moved by Helen's journey, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so that more people can discover stories that stir the soul. The Underworld Love Stories channel will continue bringing you tales of love, intense, emotional, and profoundly human, born in the space between shadow and light. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. We wish you good health, joy in every day, and the strength to find peace even in uncertain times. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next video.